addressed, and yet we continue to see disappointing situations involving RCMP's involvement with Indigenous communities. Can you comment on tangible measures being taken since and within your mandate since our last meeting to address these ongoing shortcomings of the RCMP?
Yeah, thank you very much. And certainly we've been working very closely with the Commissioner on a number of things that the Commissioner and the RCMP have been doing directly in response. I actually, if I may, Ms. Kara, I'm going to ask the Commissioner to talk about some of the steps that she's been taking because the RCMP have been working to address concerns that were raised by the committee in our last meeting.
Thank you, Minister. Some of the things that we've been looking at is obviously updating our de-escalation and crisis intervention training and making that training, recertifying that training annually. I've been leading a discussion with the police chiefs across the country on the various police chiefs on our intervention model. And looking at, we've created 2 task forces. One will be looking at a standardized framework for intervention. And the second one is in response to calls to mental health or wellness calls. And that is, again, to share best practices and to find the best ways to deal with such calls because they are obviously on the increase. We are looking at our data sets, and we've recently put many of those statistics on our website, such as physical intervention, the use of physical intervention, our calls for service, and we added employee diversity. We're looking at anti-racism training, mandatory, but it will be slightly delayed because we are going to co-develop that anti-racism training with the people that are most impacted by that and getting a lot of input to create that training. But in the meantime, we have rolled out cultural and humility training, and all senior managers have taken it. It's rolled out to all employees, and it will be mandatory for each and every employee. We are looking at race-based data. And of course, you've heard of our rollout looking at body-worn cameras. Right now, we are implementing those body-worn cameras in Nunavut. We're testing them and they will be out soon in Nunavut, but we are doing a request for information so we can get the most modern technology in those cameras across the country. We have established an office, an RCMP Indigenous co-development, collaboration, and accountability office that will reach into the communities. Of course, we're continuing to implement our national and divisional reconciliation strategies. We want to increase the use of restorative justice, especially with a focus on pre-charge restorative justice. We want to advance the equity, diversity, and inclusion within our organization as well. And we've completed an equity and diversion inclusion strategy. We also are looking at strengthening timelines for public complaint processes, updating our cadet training program to reflect all of these changes, including adding in the blanket exercise, as well as trauma-informed approach to dealing with victims. And we've created a module of a missing persons module that is specifically targeted at the subject of the missing file is an Indigenous woman. So not only will the cadets learn about the actual file and how to investigate, but also the cultural sensitivities that go with those people most impacted by such crimes.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. Minister, if I may, I know we recently extended the Canada-U.S. border closure until November 30th, and I think that's the right thing to do, as I've heard, certainly from my constituents, as well as the need for it to be closed since we're in the midst of the second wave of this pandemic. Can you perhaps update us on the situation as it stands, and what can you forecast for border closures up until the winter and with the holidays approaching to keep Canadians safe?
Thank you very much.
Very briefly,
but it's a very important question. I'm happy to be able to report to the committee. We have now returned to 2019 levels of commercial traffic, and I think that's a strong indicator of a rebounding economy. But it was also a very important part of the border restrictions that we put in place to maintain the flow of essential goods and services and essential workers back and forth across that border. However, the restrictions that we have put in place for non-essential travel, given the situation, particularly in the United States, but even the surge that we're experiencing in many parts of Canada, we believe that those border restrictions on non-essential travel have been effective in slowing down the spread of COVID, and they will remain in place as long as it's necessary to protect the health and safety of Canadians.
Thank you, Madame Kara.
Thank you.
I'm going to suspend for 2 minutes while people take various forms of health break. And we are going to recommence in 2 minutes with Mr. Van Popta for 5 minutes. I've yet to be advised as to the next Liberal questioner. So if somebody could communicate with the clerk, and the clerk in turn will communicate with me, and then we'll know who the next Liberal questioner is. So with that, 2 minutes.
Part of my ministerial responsibilities, but I can tell you that there was a lot of information that we were receiving and we were tracking very carefully, beginning even in December with the emergence of that illness in China at the time, and we continued to receive regular updates. But I don't have any direct knowledge of that organization that you referenced.
Well, certainly, Mr. Minister, that would seem to fall within your mandate, which I'm reading in your mandate letter. As Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, you will lead the government's work in assuring that Canadians are kept safe from a range of threats. Certainly, a worldwide pandemic, the worst in 100 years, would seem to fit that. So surely the Minister of Health consulted with you?
I work very closely with the Minister of Health on a number of issues, but my responsibility is overseeing the national security establishment in Canada, and of course public health is a responsibility of the Minister of Health. I might suggest you would direct your questions in that regard to her.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Were you made aware that the Communist Party was using the United Front, Workers' Front, to siphon medical supplies out of Canada into China? And certainly, if we had the global warning system, we would have detected that and been in a better position.
Well, what I can tell you is that we recognize and monitor very carefully all activities of what can sometimes be referred to as hostile state actors as it pertains to the safety and the security of Canadian interests. And the national security establishment is absolutely diligent in their responsibility to monitor that information and to take the steps necessary to protect Canadian interests. I might suggest, because I'm privileged to be joined today by our director of CSIS, who might be able to provide you with additional information as to the activities that they undertake to keep Canadians safe.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you, Mr. Van Popta, for your question. This is a very important item when we talk about the safety and security of Canadians. At CSIS, we do investigate the threats posed by different actors. We advise government and we take measures to reduce the threat. You mentioned specifically the United Workers' Front Department, the FWD. This is an organization that we're very familiar with. We are concerned about the activities of the UFWD. A number of these actions will be contrary to Canada's national security, and we are taking measures. You would understand that I cannot go into details of these measures, but this is a threat that we are seized with.
All right. So let me ask you this question then, sir. Would the early warning system have put us in a better position to have detected what was going on with United Front?
So if my understanding of the early warning, the Global Public Health Information Network, housed at the Public Health Agency, that was to do open source research to determine what we called, low signal of potential pandemic issues. This was an organization that was very much looking at the early warning from an open source perspective. Your question specifically regarding PPE and the use of UFWD to maybe obscure the sourcing and maybe procure some of the PPE in Canada to export back to China, this would not have been in the remit of the Global Public Health Intelligence Network.
Thank you, Mr. Van Popta. One of either Mr. Ananzangri, Madame Kara, or Madame Damoff. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Minister, and your colleagues for joining us today, and good to see you again. Minister, I want to just start with you, ask you a very direct question about hostile state actors. I know it's an issue that's confounding many countries, including the United States. There was a significant report out last week by the FBI, and I know in Canada it's becoming an increasingly worrisome issue. Can you comment on the steps that the government's taking towards ensuring that hostile state actors don't harm Canadians, and their role here is quite limited?
Yes, and let me tell you that this is an area which a number of my agencies and departments, and particularly CSIS, are seized with. As part of the national security establishment, we monitor very carefully the hostile activities of a number of different state actors. I would also direct you, Gary, to a report that was just earlier issued by NSICOP, which is a committee of parliamentarians that also identified the growing risk of the activities of certain countries. And for example, NSICOP did point specifically to the activities of the government of China as an example of as a state actor, which can be contrary to the interests of Canadians. And I want to be very clear, Gary, that we remain vigilant, and we are prepared to take and are taking the steps necessary to protect Canadians' interest against undue influence and intimidation for Canadians at home and abroad. And we recognize that there are activities undertaken by a number of state actors which are contrary to Canada's interest with respect to the misappropriation of intellectual property, about influencing various economic decisions. I want to assure you and this committee that we remain vigilant, and we are very thoughtful and mindful of our responsibilities to protect Canadian interests. I would leave it as well. I don't know whether the director wants to add further to that. And I think in fairness, we can't and shouldn't get into specifics of that work, but I believe Canadians need to be reassured that we remain vigilant and we are prepared to act to protect their interests.
Thank you, Minister. I'm going to pose my next question to Commissioner Lucky. So thank you for the answer, Commissioner. I do want to just say that I think within the last 6 months and since your last appearance, we've seen a continuous issue of racism that's permeated within the RCMP. I do think that one of the conversations I've had over the last several weeks is, why is there one set of rules for people who are racialized, who are Indigenous, who are Black, and why is there another set of rules for others? And we saw that clearly in the way the RCMP handled the issue of the fisheries in Nova Scotia. Madam Commissioner, we need a direct action plan. I know you've outlined several things that the RCMP is doing. However, I think, as I indicated the last time I spoke, the urgency of the situation is important. We have seen extraordinary work, and for example, the Chief of Police in Peel just signed up with the Ontario Human Rights Commission, a significant game changer in the way policing is going to be undertaken in Peel. And I think there are very concrete steps within Canada that's available for the RCMP. When can we expect direct and concrete action on racism? This is the issue of our time, in my opinion, even more so than the pandemic. And I think it's one where the relative silence is problematic. So can you just give us some specific timelines, please?
Excuse me for a second here. We're getting cross conversation.
The interpreter
Okay,
apologizes. The issue is resolved.
Okay, thank you very much. Madam Commissioner Lucky.
Yes, thank you for that question. I mentioned before, we're looking at our organization as a whole, and we're looking at those systems and those processes, those policies and procedures that will eliminate systemic racism, including, which I haven't mentioned yet, our whole recruiting process. We're looking at the way in which we recruit. We want to make sure that we are in fact reflective of the communities that we serve. And so we want to make sure our proactive recruiters are reflective of that. And within our systems that within the recruiting systems, we bring in the right people. We are going to be testing for those types of behaviors that could negatively impact their interactions. And we will be sure to bring in the best people through character-based leadership. Again, once they get in, we need to make sure that the training continues. So we've introduced a number of training initiatives at our academy, but that will continue into a full set of leadership training that we've brought in the last 6 to 8 months, or actually in the last year. And
unfortunately, we're going to have to leave the answer there. I'm sorry to be interrupting people continuously, but we are under a clock. Madame Michaud, 2.5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Lors de l'annonce sur l'assouplissement des mesures de réunification familiale en octobre dernier, le ministre a beaucoup mis d'emphase sur la nécessité pour l'Agence des services frontaliers de collaborer avec la santé publique, le ministère de l'Immigration également. Et je me demande, dans ce cas-là, l'Agence des services frontaliers relève bien du ministère de la Sécurité publique. Vous pouvez me répondre juste par oui ou par non là, pour contrainte de temps?
Yes, it does.
Dans ce cas-là, c'est particulièrement important de connaître, de savoir d'où viennent les directives et d'où provient le leadership parce que ce qu'on constate, c'est que les décisions qui sont prises aux frontières par les agents des services frontaliers sont extrêmement arbitraires. Par exemple, un cas sur lequel j'ai travaillé avec une commettante pour faire venir son conjoint de l'étranger, on me sortait des mots comme probablement, on disait que la décision finale allait être prise par la personne qui serait au point d'entrée à ce moment-là sans pouvoir me donner à l'avance des indications précises sur les cas. Et vous l'avez mentionné plus tôt, votre gouvernement agit beaucoup au cas par cas. Mais ce qu'il faut comprendre, c'est que nos commettants n'ont pas nécessairement le réflexe d'appeler leurs députés quand ils sont refoulés aux frontières. Et mon collègue a donné l'exemple de cas où des gens ont eu l'exemption et ont pu venir sur le territoire canadien sans faire de quarantaine. Alors, je me demande comment ça se fait que les mesures à l'Agence des services frontaliers ne soient pas claires et définies à l'avance et que ce soit des questions de jugement de la part de différents agents des services frontaliers.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. And you raise a couple of very important points that I'll try to answer very quickly. First of all, you refer to the business executives coming in at the border. Business executives are not exempt unless they are engaged, first of all, in essential work. And we've actually defined for the entire country, all the provinces and territories, what constitutes essential work. And it's based on the 10 critical infrastructure sectors that have been identified in the economy. And so they must be engaged in essential work. And the purpose of their travel must also be essential. And so they must be qualified for entry by being on that list. But then it's up to the border service officers to determine the essential nature of their transit into Canada. Now, with respect to compassionate cases, it often involves such things as attestations, doctors' reports, and other evidence that frankly is not able to be evaluated by the border service officer, some of it for privacy reasons. And so we've established a process, and this is very important. And if it's for qualification under a family reunification, those processes are managed by the Immigration Department, the IRCC. If it is a compassionate reason for not family related, but rather for other types of relationship, somebody coming to visit a relative who may be dying of a terminal illness, then that's managed by the Public Health Agency of Canada. That process enables officials to determine the eligibility of that person for exemption. That eligibility is predetermined, presented to the border service officer, who then can allow that individual in. It's actually a very robust system that we put in place.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave that answer there. Mr. Harris, 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. We talked about systemic racism in policing, but there's also, of course, well-known systemic racism in the prison system in our country under the Correctional Services of Canada. The Globe and Mail, Tom Cardoza's story on the last weekend identified clear racial discrimination in risk assessments leading to longer sentences, less rehabilitation program, less access to programs, and harsher treatment within prison. We've had Anthony Dub's report a couple of days ago, underscoring again discrimination and gross failure to meet the obligations under the Charter of Rights for solitary confinement, now called SIUs. These things continue layer after layer to be discovered and upended. When are we going to see actual changes that are going to reduce the prison population of Indigenous and Black and people of color? And when are we going to see these fixes being done? And I want to ask the minister that, not the representatives of the CSC. They've got 19,000 employees for 12,500 inmates, down from 14,000 a few years ago. Why is there not an action taken? Why are we waiting for oversight after oversight, reiterating the problem without a solution?
Unfortunately, you only have about less than a minute.
And Jack, we're not waiting. As a matter of fact, we actually brought in Professor Anthony Dub to oversee and to comment and assist us with the implementation of the SIUs. We take these issues very seriously, and I want to demonstrate to you how seriously. In the throne speech, Jack, I'll take you back to it. The government made a very strong commitment. We said we will introduce legislation and make investments to address systemic inequities in all phases of the criminal justice system, from diversion to sentencing, from rehabilitation to records. We've undertaken that we'll move forward on enhanced civilian oversight of all of our law enforcement agencies, including the RCMP. We're modernizing training for law enforcement, including dealing with standards of use of force, de-escalation, dealing with people in crisis, and training for anti-racism. And we've also undertaken to co-develop with Indigenous nations a new legislative framework for First Nations policing as an essential service. Jack, there's much work to do, but we've made real commitments, and I look forward to having your support.
When is it going to happen is the question.
It is a bit of a challenge for the chair to get two Irishmen to stop talking at each other. With that, we're going to move on to Mr. Motts. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, your government keeps telling Canadians that you are committed to evidence-based decision-making. In fact, your mandate letter even contains that same statement. And yet, without any evidence to support the decision, you told Canadians on May 1st, through an order in council, that you were banning military-style assault rifles under the guise of improving public safety. You and your government actually invented the term military-style assault rifle to deliberately mislead Canadians not familiar with Canada's already vigorous gun laws into believing that we have a problem where none exists. In fact, military and assault rifles are already prohibited in Canada. You know this already and have been for over 40 years. Everyone knows that taking the lazy approach and attacking legal Canada's law-abiding firearm owners will do nothing to improve public safety. Most Canadians are left to wonder what the real motive was behind the Liberal misguided gun ban plan. So, as I said, on May 1st, you banned 1,500 types and models of firearms. That firearms up to that point in time had been approved by the RCMP as safe and legal to own. Since then, nearly 500 more firearms and numerous variants have been added to that ban list, almost 2,000 now. Is that number fairly accurate?
Your mute is on.
Let me just come off of mute there and respond to some of that. And, I think, Glenn, it's important. You and I could debate it, but let's hear what the people who are responsible for keeping our communities said. The Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police said Ontario's police leaders support a prohibition on all military-designed assault rifles. And in our view, these weapons have no place in our communities, and they should be reserved only for use by Canada's military. The Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police declared that there should be a ban on the importation of these weapons, and they said that military assault rifles, their language, were produced for the sole purpose of killing people in large numbers. And the current president of the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police said on their behalf, in response to the prohibition that we introduced May 1st, as a chief of police, the Canadian Chiefs believes that the measures that taken by this government finds balance, and it ensures the safety of our members when they respond to calls for service.
Minister, you and I both know that there is no such thing. Minister, you and I both know there's no such thing as military-style assault weapons in this country. They've been banned for 40 years. So to misguide and mislead Canadians is disingenuous on your part. So you didn't answer my question about how many are actually banned, because either you don't know. So if you don't know the answer to that question, then obviously how are Canadians supposed to know, given the firearms reference table is not even available to them? It's only available to the RCMP or to law enforcement and to retailers. So I'm going to move on to the next question. In June, in the House, I asked you how many times you had changed the list of banned firearms. You told me none. Clearly, that was untrue. I asked you how many 22 caliber rifles, firearms you had banned. You didn't answer the question. I then asked you how many shotguns you had banned. You said, and I quote, did not prohibit any shotguns. Again, that was clearly untrue. In fact, the May 1st firearms ban now includes over 80 22 low caliber rifles and over 60 shotguns. Additionally, you've banned over 300 single shot rifles used for hunting and target shooting. Minister, you have made numerous statements that you know are factually inaccurate. This entire debate requires truth, honesty, and fact-based, not deliberately misguided statements or misleading statements and fear-mongering. Can you please explain to the Canadian public how 22 caliber rifles, pump action rifles, break open single shot rifles, and shotguns can possibly be categorized as military style, fully automatic rifles? Why mislead the House, the committee, and Canadians, Minister?
Yeah, just to be very clear, Glenn, we're not misleading anyone. We're taking the necessary action to strengthen gun control and to protect Canadians. And although I appreciate your advocacy on behalf of the gun lobby, our advocacy and our work is on behalf of Canadians and keeping them safe. And let me be very clear. On May 1st, we issued by order in council a prohibition, and nothing has been added to that except I would just point out to you that firearms that were prohibited in that list included designs, receivers, or other variants of rifles such as the R10 and the AR-15, which made them prohibited. And then it is the responsibility of the RCMP and the Canadian Firearms Program to identify additional weapons that contain those variants and receivers as
Minister,
prohibited.
you can't blame the RCMP for this. Minister, you can't blame the RCMP for this issue.
Anyone. Glenn, I'm not blaming anyone.
These variants, these are not military style assault rifles. You and I both know that.
Okay, well, I appreciate that vigorous interchange. With that, we're going to move on to Madame Damoff. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. I came up sooner than I thought I was going to.
Yeah.
Minister, I think I'll direct this one to you. I've been made aware of a few studies that are older studies on body-worn cameras from like 2010 to 2015. I had a group from my riding who met with your staff last week, and they had a number of more recent data, in particular a 2019 study from the Metro DC Police, which is the largest scale randomized study of body-worn cameras to date. And the conclusion was that body-worn cameras have very small and statistically insignificant effects on police use of force and civilian complaints. Now, I know there's a pilot that's happening right now in Iqaluit, and I guess my question, Minister, is I'm concerned that we could be spending money on something that could be better spent to actually transform policing, things like enhancing Indigenous policing. Pilots like the one in Toronto at the Native Family and Child Services, which is based on Quanlin Dunn, to deal with urban Indigenous policing issues. So mental health support. So I guess my question, Minister, is, are we treating Iqaluit as a pilot and actually looking at data, or have we made a commitment for body cameras for all of the RCMP?
Thank you very much. It's an important question. And Pam, I want to be really clear. We're not talking as body cameras as a panacea and a response to all of the myriad of issues and concerns that have been identified. But one of the concerns that we heard very clearly is the need for accountability. And there is a very strongly held belief, and I believe there is evidence, that the best evidence of a transaction or an interaction between the police and any citizen is video evidence. And we've seen the value of that video evidence. It's revealed cases that otherwise would never have come to light. And so ensuring that there is an accurate record of that interaction is an important element of accountability. But the camera in and of itself doesn't do anything unless we also have very strong regimes of fulsome accountability, which are both transparent and fair and timely. And we've in this earlier discussions, we talked about the importance of putting those systems in place. And so we're absolutely committed to putting in a far more robust system of oversight and accountability. And I believe making sure that there is the best evidence of those transactions is also an element. There's also some suggestion, I believe, that when there is a record, an accurate record of the interaction between the police and the public, people tend to behave themselves a little better, ideally. I think that's hopeful. And, we saw some of those terrible tragedies in the United States, for example. The George Floyd incident likely would not have come to the public's attention without the video evidence that was available. And that quite frankly has changed the world and changed our society. And that video evidence is compelling, and I believe it is the basis of very strong reform. And so I just want to assure you that we've been working with the Iqaluit and with the territories and with the provinces I believe that there are a number of measures that we can take, but I want to also assure you, they don't take the body cameras, for example, as one element of improving accountability, does not take the place of all of the other important work of improving training and hiring and all the relationship building and the work that we must do in communities to connect with people. And that involves a number of different policing models. As I've mentioned, a new legislative framework for dealing with Indigenous policing. There's a great deal of work to do. And although one element, I think there's value in the body cam rollout. We're seeing that in police jurisdictions right across Canada, and it will include the RCMP, but it's not all that we need to do. And certainly it's not anyway, it's not an alternative. It's in addition to the things that need to happen.
Thanks.
A little less than a minute.
Okay, thanks, Minister. I just, I guess I go back to my question about Colton Boushie, though. If we can't get reports back when there are issues and complaints that come forward, and I know you're as frustrated as I am with that, Minister. So I'll turn the rest of my time over to Ms. May.
And if I could just respond very quickly to that, I agree that complaint systems, to be fair and to actually serve people, they have to be objective, they have to be fair, and they have to be kindly. And it's not fair to the complainant, and it's not fair to the police officer to have these matters unresolved for an almost indefinite period of time. We'll bring forward, I know the commissioner and the CRCC chair are working on new timelines, but I believe that we may require legislative and regulatory amendment that compel people to get that done on time.
Okay,
Thank
thanks.
you, Ms. Damoff. Ms. Stubbs, 5 minutes, and I did hope to squeeze a question in from Ms. May towards the end of this final round.
Okay, thanks, Chair. I'll try to speak speedily, although I know it's the
Oh.
work for the translators.
Yes.
Minister, just a quick question, because corrections is under your mandate. In the latest correctional investigators report, he raised serious concerns about euthanasia in prisons. And he's called on the government to stop the practice altogether. Today he was at the committee and he said, quote, he is deeply disturbed by 3 instances that he said, quote, should never have happened. You did respond to the report, but you didn't make a commitment on that exact recommendation. So I just wonder, yes or no, if you plan to implement it.
Yeah, no. First of all, to be clear, the corrections investigator pointed out very serious concerns with medical assistance in dying that took place within the institution, and he believed that wasn't appropriate. I agree with him, and we'll together take steps to ensure that people who require that assistance receive it in a health facility, not inside a prison.
Thanks, Minister. Just following up on some of the questions from our colleague MP Michaud, you had talked about declaring, you had answered in a part about declarations of workers who are essential. I do just want to tell you from the ground, there is confusion and inconsistency even about those decisions. For example, I have a constituent who told me that he's a pilot. He came with another pilot from the exact same conference, from the exact same state. They came to the border. One was arbitrarily determined to be essential, and then the other wasn't. And literally, they traveled together. So there seem to be still problems even in that area. But in addition, you note that when billionaire Uline executives were granted access to Canada and exempt from those quarantine restrictions in August, you said the CBSA made a mistake. You said, quote, a decision was made by officers based on the information provided and entry should not have been permitted. So just wondering if you could tell us what specific direction or guidance you subsequently gave CBSA to prevent decisions that you say are mistakes.
Yeah, certainly, Shannon, and unfortunately, it was incorrectly reported. And I remember when you asked me the question, suggesting that the national interest exemption had been granted in that case. That wasn't true. It was a decision, in fact, made by the border service officer. I wonder if the president of CBSA, John Osowski, can talk a little bit about the direction that he gave to his officers in response to that case.
That's okay, Minister. That's okay, Minister. I'll just move on a couple more questions for you. Because you had said it was a mistake, I just had wondered what directions you had given. But just for more clarity, last week when I asked about the UPS executive coming to Canada, your colleague Minister Champagne said that exemptions are granted after extensive consultations by global affairs along with the public health agencies and the provinces and the territories. So on one hand, there seems to be an assertion that decisions are made individually by CBSA agents on a case-by-case basis. Yet another minister says that they're made after extensive consultation with multiple groups. So I guess it's fair for Canadians to be confused. I just have questions about Canadian citizens themselves and a couple of examples. Canadians who may make a wrong turn and end up at the border are being forced to quarantine when they turn around and go home, or Canadians who need to simply deal with a visa issue. They're given papers saying they were never in the US, but CBSA still instructs them to put their lives on hold and quarantine for 14 days. And then a colleague also told me about an elderly man who went too far and he ended up at a border crossing by mistake. The US border officials did politely tell him to turn around. He didn't leave his car, but then when he came to the CBSA officials, he was told to go home and quarantine for 14 days. So I think it's fair for Canadians to be asking specifically for clarity about this double standard, the inconsistency, why American elite billionaires are granted quarantine exemptions and able to travel the country freely, yet Canadian citizens in these variety of different situations are being told to put their lives on hold and quarantine in their homes.
Thank you very much, Shannon.
Please.
Yeah, just a couple of things. First of all, there are no billionaires that are given a carte blanche. In the vast majority of cases, whenever there is a national interest exemption, I'll give you an example of one that I granted. There was an American citizen who had to come to Canada. She was the victim of a very serious sexual assault and had to come up and testify against her accuser. Otherwise, the court was going to lose jurisdiction. That was an Alberta case, and I issued a national interest exemption for that person to come into the country. But we put in place with the regional and provincial health authority and the Public Agency of Canada a very rigorous regime for that individual to follow to make sure the Canadians were not put at risk. I also want to assure you that with respect to those individuals who had left Canada and then were turned back, we resolved that issue by order in council that was issued effective October 31st, so 2 days ago. And now those individuals will be able to return without going into quarantine unless they got out and were exposed on the American side, in which case we'll take whatever steps are necessary to protect Canadians' health and safety.
We're going to have to leave the answer there. Madame Cara, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Commissioner Kelly. Commissioner, we had Dr. Zinger before this committee just an hour ago on his annual report. And his report was quite appalling in terms of showcasing the unfortunate reality of correctional services. He was very critical about the lack of access of credible educational and vocational resources available to inmates, as it impedes on their ability to find meaningful work opportunities upon completion of their sentence. Can you talk a bit about what are some of the educational and vocational opportunities that are currently provided, and what is your plan to incorporate some of his recommendations?
Commissioner Kelly.
Sorry, I'm having trouble getting off mute. Okay. So for us, obviously, education, vocational training, employment are key factors for the safe and successful reintegration of offenders. And I just want to share with you of the offenders that have an identified need for an upgrade to their education. When we look at 2017-18 and up to now, it's actually been increasing the percentage. Same with the offenders with an identified need for vocational training. Our percentages have been increasing. The other good thing is when we look at the results related to that upgrade in education prior to the end of the sentence, for Indigenous offenders, that also has been increasing. It's actually for Indigenous offenders, 74% compared to 65% for non-Indigenous offenders. And so this is certainly an increase. So, and the same applies to women. There's been an increase from 64.7 to 80%. I heard what the OCI had to say. Definitely, we offer a number of vocational training with third-party certification. And I do want to stress that in 2008, 19, 20, it was probably the highest that we've offered. Almost 18,000 certifications were earned by men offenders, of which 5,000 were for Indigenous men. And then 2,500 for women, of which 1,000 were for Indigenous women. And our vocational certifications cover a significant breadth of types of employment. So it's safety certification, construction, horticulture, manufacturing, and definitely where Corcan is working very, very hard to expand the breadth of services that we can offer. The other thing that we're looking at, and we're quite excited, we discussed it at our executive committee just 2 weeks ago. It's established a virtual approach to deliver critical CSC correctional programs digitally. Certainly, COVID-19 for us has showed us that we need to move more into digital services. Definitely, CSC has its challenges, but this is where we're moving to. We're also ready to launch a digital education pilot at one of our Ontario institutions. I will admit, it's been in the works for quite some time, but now it's going to be launched. I'm looking forward to the results because this is something that we're going to be looking at expanding.
Thank you.
1 minute.
My next question's for Commissioner Lucky. Commissioner, perhaps I alluded to this question last time you were here, but we've had some significant number of witnesses that talked about this. There have been many calls for the reconstructing of the RCMP to remove contract policing. We've certainly heard this call from numerous witnesses mentioning that RCMP is too big and has too many roles, which makes it difficult, if not impossible, to govern, and that the RCMP needs to get out of contract policing. We've seen disappointing shortcomings of this, even just recently, and RCMP's failed approach to advance Indigenous reconciliation. In fact, we've seen quite the opposite. Can you comment on if you think the current RCMP contracting model is a good idea, considering your mandate to advance Indigenous reconciliation, or should it be removed?
Unfortunately, that question took it down to about 3 seconds to answer, which would be probably an unsatisfactory response. So I'm going to have to, we'll have to ask that question some other point. Madame Michaud, 2.5 minutes. Mr. Harris, 2.5 minutes. And I'm going to try and get Madame May in for 2.5 minutes as well. And that should pretty well do it. So Madame Michaud, 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je serais peut-être moins en accord avec mes collègues conservateurs sur cette question-là. Votre engagement, Monsieur le ministre, à l'égard des armes à feu. Vous promettiez de bannir les armes d'assaut, mais ce qu'on constate, c'est qu'il y a toujours certains modèles qui sont en vente. Je pense par exemple au Remington ACR, qui a des aspects assez similaires à l'AR-45, l'AR-15, pardonnez-moi. Le SKS aussi qui ressemble beaucoup au K-47, mais qui a un chargeur fixe. C'est des armes qui sont toujours non restreintes à l'heure actuelle. Et il y a plusieurs autres armes comme ça qui tombent dans les cracks de votre réglementation. Ce qu'on constate, c'est que le problème, c'est que votre gouvernement a choisi de légiférer sur les armes qui sont plus populaires ou plus fréquentes, au lieu de définir clairement ce qu'est une arme d'assaut et de les bannir toutes d'un coup. Et la réalité, c'est que vous réagissez aux tragédies qui arrivent comme celle de la Nouvelle-Écosse, au lieu d'agir en prévention et de prendre le temps de bien faire les choses. Donc, en bannissant avec des modèles qui sont plus fréquents, ce qui peut arriver, c'est que les gens vont se tourner simplement vers d'autres modèles qui peuvent tout aussi bien faire le travail. Alors, croyez-vous pas qu'en faisant ça, vous rendez votre mesure complètement inutile? Vous êtes sur mute, Monsieur le
Your
ministre.
mute button. Minister, your mute button.
Thank you. I believe that the measures we put in place have been very effective, and we've essentially stopped the market for those weapons. I will also tell you the criteria that we applied, for example, with respect to the SKS carbon, was that they be of modern design. And of course, the SKS carbon, its origins was back during the Second World War, and so it was not included on this list. But I also want to assure you, Ms. Michaud, that in addition to the legislation that I've talked about bringing forward, we're also looking at establishing an evergreen process so that the Canadian Firearms Program will continue to evaluate weapons that represent a risk and that will enable us to make sure that weapons that should be not available in Canada won't be available in Canada, because we know that the gun industry is agile and adept at bringing forward new models and variants in order to try to get around the rules. That we've seen evidence of that quite vigorously over the past several years. And so we'll have a system that maintains an evergreen process of classification that will be necessary to keep Canadians safe.
Thank you. Mr. Harris, 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Blair, you mentioned you quoted back the throne speech to me in response to my question about action. Yet, you had a recommendation back in June from Ivan Ziegler of the legislation related to fixing the issue of in the prisons related sexually coercive violence, and Mr. Singer said today something that struck me as being very remarkable, that the CSC has a history of being dismissive and unresponsive to recommendations that he has. So I have two questions to you. Why are you passing the buck to this committee to look at legislation instead of sending it off to the Justice Department to go ahead and draft something? Because there's a great set of recommendations and plans set out by Dr. Zinger. And secondly, are you going to fix this business of the CSC being unresponsive and dismissive of recommendations from the correctional investigator?
Yeah, Jack, these are important questions. First of all, with respect to Dr. Zinger's report on sexual violence and sexual coercion in our institutions, that's completely unacceptable. He did make recommendations for us to consider legislation, and I actually thought that the Public Safety Committee, all of you, might find the opportunity to really contribute to that discussion, to make sure that we take an appropriate and comprehensive response to that. It's entirely up to the committee, by the way. I'll leave it to all of your good judgment whether or not you think that's an effective use of your time. We're still quite prepared to deal with the issue. There are a number of other ways, as you've suggested. I actually have a great deal of respect for the input and the contribution that parliamentarians can make to this, and I thought it might be something worthy of your response. I also don't agree that CSC has been non-responsive, but at the same time, I really value the work of the correction investigator. He and I speak quite frequently, and I am absolutely committed to ensuring that we do the things that are necessary to produce better outcomes for people in our correction institutions, and that we fulfill our duty of care to keep them safe while they are incarcerated in our federal institutions. And so I work very closely with the federal investigator. I very much value his advice and his work. And I will also tell you that in my work with the Correction Services of Canada and Commissioner Kelly, I believe them to be very sincere in their desire and in their effort to produce better outcomes. I cited earlier in the discussion the extraordinary work they did in the pandemic to keep their inmates safe. I believe that they are making progress, and I am prepared to support them in that work based on the excellent advice we receive from the correction investigator, and hopefully with good advice and input from the Public Safety Committee as well.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Thank you, Minister Blair. Why is it with Minister Blair and Mr. Harris, I am forever struggling to stay within the time frame? It's just coincidental. Madame May, who will, of course, never stray beyond the time frame that's allocated to her, which in this case is 2.5 minutes.
I'm extremely grateful, Mr. Chair, for this opportunity. And I want to put this to Minister Blair. The language in the mandate letter around, I had to search for it really to figure, is this really speaking to racism? But the idea that you have been mandated to address, quoting, unconscious bias, cultural competency training seems to coalesce around the idea that Superintendent Leckie has told us that we're going to see anti-racism training. I want to put something to you, Mr. Blair, and ask if you don't think this would be more productive. In the United States in 2006, the FBI reported that white supremacist groups were deliberately infiltrating law enforcement, deliberately infiltrating the US military. I would like to ask you to do, if you're willing to take this on and ask your CBSA and RCMP directors to do a complete screen of the social media content of all their employees and find the ones that belong to Proud Boys, find the ones that were white supremacists who don't have unconscious bias, but have overt racism, and remove those people from service.
Elizabeth, if I may respond, I agree that there's absolutely no place in policing, in law enforcement, or in any element of public service for racists and white supremacists and anti-Semites and Islamophobes. And I think that we have a responsibility to purge those influences and those individuals from the public service and most certainly from policing. I will tell you that I believe that the overwhelming majority of police officers do their job with integrity and professionalism and very sincere respect for all of the people in Canada. But we also know that ideologically motivated extremism, white supremacy is unfortunately and tragically pervasive in certain elements of our society. And I am completely in agreement that there needs to be absolute vigilance among those responsible for policing and our military and any other element of public service to make sure that there is no place for it there. And I will also assure you that we are pretty vigorous in the national security establishment. We've started to clearly identify the threat of ideological motivated extremism, and in particular white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and others. And we're tracking them down and making sure that we take action effective to prevent their influence in our society.
Are you looking for them within the forces? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, yes, and that was the question as to whether you were actually look for them. Anyway, you can respond directly. I believe my Conservative colleagues have a minute or two. With Mr. Kirk, is that?
That is correct. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister. It's been a very enlightening evening. A couple quick questions. Can you share with the committee what percentage of rail cars are inspected as they come across our borders?
I would defer that question to the person responsible for the inspection of rail cars crossing the border, and that would be the president of the CBSA.
If I could get a quick answer on that, that'd be fantastic.
Well, why don't I undertake to you that we'll get you that information, and I will make sure that we send it to you. I will tell you that CBSA does an extraordinary job of collecting data, and I have a ton of it I'm happy to share with you.
Well, I appreciate that, Minister. And I would just as a final statement say there's been a number of rail workers and border enforcement officers that have brought forward significant concerns to me, saying that the percentage is very, very low and there's an inadequate regime when it comes to the follow through on ensuring that contraband and illegal goods crossing our borders in rail cars is well taken care of. But I would cede the rest of my time to my colleague, Mr. Motz, if there is.
There's 1 minute left for Mr. Motz.
Perfect. Minister, as you know, there's crime labs, evidence labs are a significant part of the landscape for law enforcement in this country. And as a result, we see that currently the RCMP provides, lab services to, they have the nationally mandated lab services for those law enforcement agencies who don't have their own lab or can't afford to use private labs. And we know that there's huge delays. They're being rejected. Certain amounts of evidence are being rejected. And I'm being told by crime techs from the RCMP lab that they're restricting capacity, limiting capacity, and they're even limiting the outsourcing of evidence currently to private labs, which even adds further to those backlogs. We know we're losing convictions on serious crimes, sexual assaults across this land because of that. I'm wondering whether you would commit today to ensure that we address those backlogs, Minister, and to make sure that we get those who commit these crimes are held responsible based on the evidence that's been gathered, and that we don't lose them because we can't get them the lab results back in a timely manner.
Very briefly.
Yeah, very quickly, Glenn, it's a very important question. I agree that the National Police Service and the labs that they oversee, the RCMP oversees, provide very important services, not just to the RCMP, but to police services across the country. I don't want to get back into you with the impact of all the cuts that the RCMP experienced, but we've been significantly reinvesting in their capacity to deliver those services, and because we recognize how important they are as well.
With that, that brings our evening to the close. I want to thank Minister Blair and all of the officials for spending these last 2 hours with us. I particularly appreciate the change in the threat posture with respect to the government of China. I have long been taking a public position that we have to treat China differently. So it was encouraging to hear the minister's comments. You also, colleagues, knows that we don't have Jean-Marie David as our clerk tonight. Jean-Marie has been reassigned away from this committee, and we now have a new clerk, Mike McPherson, and welcome, Mike, to the committee, and thank you for keeping us on track. And finally, colleagues, I just wanted to say that we keep getting all of these assignments and pile up of work. Unless I hear otherwise, I'm going to see if I can squeeze out two hours next week, and we'll do a virtual meeting, even though the House is not sitting, just to try and work into the backlog in the pile. So with that, thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, officials. And good evening.
Yeah, well, that was a bunch of bollocks. I was hoping to hear more. Sorry, I jumped in late. There didn't seem to be anything in there, funnily enough, about Nova Scotia, which is pretty interesting. Though what is interesting is that if nobody else can see it, they're destroying every institution from within on purpose. This has been going on for a long time, and it's really transparent that they just want to destroy it. They want to wreck everything. And, you got Lucky sitting up there wrecking her own police force. Systemic racism, what does she answer? Something about jumping over a wall. The wall is too tall. It's racist because it's too tall. That was always an interesting quote I found. Okay, I'm going to start another stream. Yeah, exactly. Well, if the hat, yes, it has to do with the underwear. If you can't give me my underwear, you can pay me. I want my money back. I think we all deserve our money back from these clowns, and they need to be run out of town. Now, actors, big actors. So we're going to start another stream after this. I do hope that you join me. I don't really want to wade too much into their garbage because that's what they want people to get off in. And we got to stay away from that. And I just want to stay with Nova Scotia because that's a big enough story as it is. So thanks very much for those of you who join me. I will start a stream immediately after this. So feel free to come in and we will talk about Nova Scotia. God bless.